Good afternoon and welcome to this keynote today that I have to, get off a little bit and just say that it's one that I'm maybe the most excited about. We're really honored to have Michael Brickman speak to us from the Department of Ed. Most of you all know that Innovate Educate's been on the journey of skills-based hiring since 2008, and I want to recognize Dr. Marilee Mayo, who's on the call with us, who was my true partner in crime when we started this work around skills-based hiring in New Mexico a long time ago. So we've been keeping in touch and reached out to the department and requested for Michael to speak to us today. And he's going to bring us some great expertise. As far as Michael Brickman, he has been working around the innovative education workforce development pathways at the U.S. Department of Ed as senior advisor in the office of the undersecretary. He's been advising the undersecretary on the entire portfolio for the last several years. Previously, he served as national policy director of the Fordham Institute, which was a national think tank. And Michael also served as a policy advisor to Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, where he was very involved in school choice expansion and the first public competency-based education programs. So Michael is a native of Wisconsin, graduated from University of Delaware, and he currently lives in Washington, D.C., which we know there's a lot of changes happening in D.C. So thank you, Michael, for being with us through what I would consider is probably a turbulent time in your department. Welcome.
It is. Thanks for having me. I'm at the Department of Education and look forward to continuing to be there for many, many days, 41 days left to be exact. And I really would love to talk about all of the different things that we've been working on over the last 4 years, but the one I really wanted to focus on today, and I know is of greatest interest to this group, is the not just the Department of Education's, but the entire federal government's effort around skills-based hiring. And so I would love to just kind of talk from first principles and how we arrived at the changes we ended up making, and can talk a little bit about where I see things going, hopefully from here, although as I leave, it will be in the hands of others. So let's talk about where we are right now. There's $1.6 trillion in student debt. It is the largest category of consumer debt other than mortgages. This has steadily increased over the decades and has far outpaced inflation. And so as the cost gets higher and higher to get the same education for the same job, it's getting harder and harder to then pay down that debt. And that brings us to the situation that we're in. But that's not the only cost that's really talking about the traditional higher education system overall every year. So not overall, or not, over time, the accumulated $1.6 trillion in debt, but every year, just in the US, we spend about 1.1 trillion in education and training after K-12. And so that's a huge investment of time and resources to ensure that people get the skills they need for the job. How do we make sure we're doing that in as efficient and effective way as possible? It's not just the workers who are trying to get more training, but it's also the employers who are working to find these people. And they spend about $500 billion looking for people. The staffing industry globally spends a tremendous amount of money. And often that results in a situation where you have applicants sending resumes that respond to job postings. And because that's such an inexact science, it's so difficult to really read between the lines and understand whether I might be right for a position or whether a candidate might be right for the position I'm hiring for. So much more and more is done by AI. You have software that sorts through these applicants. It's more than a human often could possibly read. And so very often, we've all been through this, you submit your application and you probably that application never sees, is never seen by human eyes. And that can be a really frustrating and difficult experience. And so the common wisdom for people who are applying for jobs is just to send off as many resumes as possible. And for the people looking for workers, you try to spend as much time as possible, because you know it's going to take a while to sort through all of those applications, narrow it down. Very often searches fail. I know at our agency, and I'm talking public sector, where hopefully we're less efficient than everybody else, because it's hard to imagine sometimes how things could be less efficient if you tried. But we have a large percentage, I've heard more than half of our searches do not result in a hire. And so that's a tremendous amount of wasted time and energy from our staff, many of whom are excellent and are doing their best to sort through these applications they get, but they're tied in through layers and layers of bureaucracy. And I know that's true of the federal government, but it's true of private sector employers as well. And there's another challenge here that I think has really come to light, especially this year, and that's this goal of improving diversity and inclusion. We all know about the skills gaps that go all the way back through K-12 and to early childhood education and even before. But a lot of those things are just kind of baked into the numbers. We at the department put out educational attainment numbers, as does the Census Bureau every year. And in fact, there are entire categories of difference between white, Black, and Hispanic adults in terms of educational attainment. And so it's a lot of these structures that have built up over time, where by the time you get through post-secondary education and are looking for a job, there can be significant gaps in the level of attainment. So you end up with these big achievement gaps. And if you are a well-meaning employer and you're really trying to diversify, if you are just randomly selecting people with a bachelor's degree and literally drawing bachelor's degree candidates out of a hat, you're not going to get a diverse workforce, odds are, because of these achievement gaps that have, as I said, have built up over time. And so it can be very difficult to achieve these goals, even when you're really, really trying, if you're only looking at traditional educational qualifications. And so that's one reason we wanted to look at this. I know it's a reason that many employers are looking at this, but it's a real challenge because the traditional higher education pathways are driving up the cost of education, driving up the cost of HR, and making it harder to link people who are genuinely qualified with jobs where they're needed. And so as a result, there's great research that's been done, including by Innovative Educate, on this problem. I know we've seen numbers like close to 90% of small businesses that are hiring or trying to hire report that they have few or no qualified applicants. When surveyed, 75% of HR professionals found skills gaps in the candidates they're sorting through. And as a result, the average position takes currently about 36 days, so over a month, and $4,400 to fill. And so we get into this broken system, and often it's way more about who you know, more so than what you know. And that leads to a situation where you're 9 times more likely to get a job if you have a referral. It always helps to have a referral if you're a candidate, but it really points to a system that is not directly linked to skills. It's linked to relationships, and that further can cement some of these inequities in the system. So talking specifically about this problem that we've seen it in our accreditation system, where it takes more and more education to get the same job, and that gets locked in through occupational licensing, it gets locked in through accreditation. but you have this problem of degree inflation, and a lot of groups have looked at this. Um, about a quarter of America's customer service representatives have a bachelor's degree. There's a study that says 20% of executive assistants have a bachelor's degree currently, so only about 1 in 5, but 67%, about 2/3 of new postings require a degree. So there's a very swift ramp up in certain jobs for a bachelor's degree, even though the job has not changed all that much over the years and over the decades. And as a result, we find that about 1 in 4 bachelor's degree holders are currently overqualified for the job that they have. So they've paid for this degree that they're not using. Specifically from Innovate and Educate, this is one of my favorite studies you all have done. Although 1% of, I'm just going to quote from it, while only 1% of disconnected high-risk young adults aged 16 to 24 could qualify for a job based on a degree requirement, almost 33% of those same young adults have the skills and cognitive abilities equivalent to college graduates. And so we know there are people out there that we're missing because of the way we hire, where it's based on degrees, it's based on years of experience, and it's based on who you know. So why hasn't this been fixed? Everybody who's on this panel is very familiar with the challenge, and I think we're all working together to try to fix it. But I've observed some reasons why I think it's not been solved yet. And the first is it's hard. It's hard to know, if you're not going to hire based on a degree, what do you signal for? That's the ultimate question. And it's difficult because we know there are really strong credentials out there. And we know there are really great applicants out there, but how do we marry these things together? And I think the real problem comes down to this catch-22, where employers are not going to use non-degree credentials, even if they're really great, until there are a critical mass of applicants who have earned them. So if you have a really great credential that 10 people have earned, what's the point in putting it in your job posting? You're never going to find one of those 10 people who happen to apply. On the other hand, applicants are not going to pursue those non-degree credentials, even if they're really great, if they're not going to lead to a job. So you have this problem where there are lots and lots of credentials out there that few have earned and few are signaling for in their job postings, and no one's going to change until we find a way around that. And I think we have in the public sector. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, specifically how we've done that in a few minutes. So why else has this not been solved? Often CEOs are very supportive of this. They come to educational gatherings, they come to workforce gatherings, they come meet with their peers in DC or elsewhere and share their support. It's hard to have a conversation about skills gaps or education and workforce without talking about some of these issues today. And yet there still does not seem to be tremendous progress, especially in the private sector. And so I think while the CEOs are supportive, it's really hard to implement. And so there can be a disconnect between the CEOs and the chief human capital officers when the CEOs go back to their office. In addition, we know there are more online free or low cost, really high quality resources than ever before. And you can teach yourself almost anything on Coursera or Udacity or even YouTube. But those credentials, if there even is a credential other than simply going through a course or watching a video, are not necessarily going to lead to a job because they're not recognized in the same way as a traditional bachelor's degree. And so we have to solve for this recognition problem. And I know many of you are working on things like building better portfolios and helping applicants better communicate the things that they know, even if they didn't learn them through a traditional pathway. So that's yet another challenge. In addition, there's I think a lot of energy around, well, traditional higher ed isn't working, so let's build a better university. And some of that is definitely needed, especially in the areas of affordability and ensuring that we're reaching people who are not traditionally going to a a normal post-secondary environment. They're not going to a four-year campus immediately after they graduate from high school. So there do need to be new approaches that work for today's learners, but that's often a really high effort endeavor that can be extremely expensive and might not reach students at scale. There are 7,000 traditional institutions. Adding a couple more non-traditional institutions might not make the impact at scale. And you still run into the problem of, if no one's heard of the school you went to because it's brand new, you're going to have a challenge communicating that to a future employer. And finally, I think there's an two more items actually I want to mention. I think there's an over-reliance by companies that really want to make a difference in this area on creating their own pathways. So we're going to create a non-traditional pathway, but they run into problems where it's only recognized by employer X. So it's the employer X credential, it's recognized by that employer, but if you want to take that to another employer, it can be difficult. And the same problem occurs with a lot of the upskilling efforts or the employer training efforts that exist today, where you can train people up, you can give them a badge, you can give them a credential, and that's better. That's a huge improvement over the past where you got nothing and you just said, oh, well, I did this training at my last job. You now have some sort of demonstration of it, which is great. And there are more platforms where you can share those credentials. But the next step is to ensure that they're truly transferable and they're recognized universally. And that's just not something that exists right now for the most part. And finally, the problem that I mentioned before around an over-reliance on algorithms and AI to figure out who you should hire. I think those can be really useful tools and they can help humans make better decisions, take out some of the drudgery of sorting through various documents to better organize and align all these different resumes or all these different portfolios that you've received and put it in a more human-friendly way. But an algorithm can't tell you who to hire. And I think there's a belief that maybe we can get there someday. Maybe someday, but I don't think anytime soon. So it needs to be, these tools are valuable, but they need to be supporting human decision-making, not replacing it. So we were looking at all of these challenges from the Department of Education. We were doing things to, through our regulations, make it easier to build employer education partnerships so these skills can be integrated into degree programs, making it easier to hold institutions accountable, giving our accreditors flexibility so they could empower traditional colleges and universities to do these types of things. And of course, we've been supportive of efforts in Congress to allow for greater funding for short-term training programs and things like that. And we hope those things will come soon. But at the end of the day, we realized that this is something that has to be employer-led more than anything. Because again, if you get in if you go through a non-traditional path that leads to a dead end and doesn't lead to a job, it's not helping anyone. These pathways can't just stand on their own. And as much as it would be nice if simply the fact that one of these pathways was high quality was enough, the sad truth is it's not. There has to be some recognition and there has to be an end game where those high quality pathways can lead to a good family supporting job. And so we worked with employers. We were working with interagency, other federal government agencies to support this type of thing and vocally encourage employers to hire based on skills, to recognize apprenticeships and other pathways that could be more inclusive. And more we heard from some of those employers who were turning it back on us, and I think rightfully so. They said, well, look, the federal government is the nation's largest employer. Why are you not doing anything about this too? Because the truth is the vast majority of federal government jobs either require a degree or preference a degree. And this is how this goes, because you'll often hear, okay, no, it's really only about a third of the federal government jobs require a degree. And that's true if you only look at the absolute requirements. You must have a degree for this job. But for the other 2/3, you then need to demonstrate either education or experience. So there are two pathways to get in. The education path, so we're still talking about the same educational qualifications, even at a very, even fairly low in the federal government pay scale, you're required to have 4 years or more of post-secondary education experience. Or you can have, so you can have the post-secondary experience, or you can have the workplace experience of an equivalent number of years. The challenge there is many agencies, including ours, have very few rungs low enough on the ladder where you can qualify simply based on your experience or simply based on a non-educational pathway. And so we say that there are these pathways there, but the problem is there are so few on-ramps for people who have less than a 4-year degree that in practice, they're really not there at all. And so in practice, the overwhelming number of jobs really need you to have a degree, because you know, even the second or third tier jobs up the seniority scale across the federal government require you to get the experience lower on the ladder, and even those jobs require either some post-secondary education experience or some workplace experience, but there's, again, a catch-22 where you can't get the experience without the degree. And as somebody just commented, the work experience is just as problematic. Absolutely. It can be very, you start to get really subjective on, you know, what counts. And it's in the federal government, you say, okay, if you've had a year of experience at the next lowest level within the federal government, check the box. That's easy. Just like it's easy to say if you have a 4-year degree, check the box. But once you start getting into these equivalencies of, okay, what's equivalent work experience to federal experience, it starts to get a little dicey. Just like if you start to say, well, technically we can evaluate a non-degree educational pathway, but what's equivalent? And the safest, easiest thing for somebody in HR to do is just put people in the traditional path, because no one's ever going to question it. No one's ever, you know, no one ever, I've heard people say before, no one's ever gotten fired for hiring somebody with a 4-year degree from a well-respected educational institution. And that's the problem we need to overcome. It's cultural within these employers as much as it is about changing the rules. But we've started to look at changing the rules, and that's the first step. And so what we've done is we looked at the challenges in the federal government, and we took up this challenge from the private sector employers to not just walk the walk, or not just talk the talk, but walk the walk as well. And so we started to get together, a few of us from, it was me from education, some folks from the Department of Labor, Office of Personnel Management, Office of Management and Budget, and a couple of other places, and started to brainstorm ideas around what was the most effective way to start to change this. And we realized that we needed to change not only the educational requirements, but the educational preferences as well. And so we wrote down these ideas and ultimately determined that it's something that the Office of Personnel Management, which is really the leader on this, could have done on its own, but an executive order is much more powerful because it has the force of law. It's being directed from obviously the highest levels, and it puts a little bit more urgency on it. And in fact, we included specific deadlines. in the executive order. And so we drafted this. We worked with folks around the federal government and worked with the White House counsel's office to perfect this and get it in a way, get it in a format that was going to be useful for all agencies. We had to think a lot about kind of edge cases and make sure that our wording was just right, and they were really helpful in helping us perfect it. And then ultimately the president signed it. It became Executive Order 13932 in June. And we then got to the hard work, because it was easy to define what the rules around this should be, but now we had to focus on the implementation. So how do you actually get beyond talking about this and actually start to do it? So the first step was to define the competencies that we were going to be looking for across each of the different job classifications across the government. And there's a lot to do there. The good news is a lot of that work had already been done by the agencies. Surveys are regularly conducted, subject matter experts were utilized, and there is a definition of these are the competencies that should be used for each job. I don't have time probably to go into all of the details of how that can be improved. There's still work to do there, but we had a starting place, and that was the really good news there. And so from each of those competencies, we needed a way to measure them. And at first blush, you say, okay, well, we need to look at tests and we need to look at third-party credentials. But we can't have these tests be the only replacement. There were many in the federal government who felt that what we really needed to do was to simply update the civil service exam, because there used to be a single exam that was your entry point into many, many federal jobs, called the civil service exam. And that's another long story that I probably don't have time to get into, but that had gone out of use, and there had actually been lawsuits around that because of disparate impact issues. But what I think after discussion we realized we didn't want to do was to replace this single door of bachelor's degrees and just say, okay, well, we're going to get rid of the bachelor's degree door and replace it with the assessment door. That might not have excluded all of the same people, but it would have been similarly exclusionary in that there'd be a single way in, a single point of failure. If that test doesn't work and isn't measuring the things you want it to test, you run into some of the same problems. So what we realized is we needed to, for each of these competencies, utilize multiple tools. So there can be still a pathway for people who have traditional post-secondary education experience. We don't want to just throw that out, because it's extremely valuable for many people if they can demonstrate that what they learned on campus translates to the job, and they actually earned the competencies through a traditional post-secondary education setting, as many people do. So there's nothing at all wrong with that. But that's just one of several paths in that we wanted to create. And so we have that as one door. We have apprenticeship that can be a door in, assessment, traditional tests can be a door, but also third-party credentials, and particularly things that are valued by the private sector. We don't want to reinvent the wheel in all of this. Where there are good assessments, where there are good credentials that we can create, and there are gaps, especially around things that are unique to federal service, we want to create those. But we also want to look to the private sector, and for IT positions, we should be looking to tech. For grant-making positions, we should be looking to what the private sector is doing to ensure that their staff know how to maximize impact around our discretionary grant competitions. But we also realized that there were many positions where we already had signaled a value for some sort of third-party credential. And this was maybe the biggest takeaway and would be my advice for where the private sector should start with this. Because what we found is there were many jobs where we said, you must have a degree for this position or a degree in experience. And I talked about the problems with that. But then we said, all right, thank you for proving you have your degree. We checked the box, but here's the thing. We know you didn't actually learn about, for example, federal discretionary grant competitions in your bachelor's degree program. Even if it was a political science or a government administration degree, you just didn't learn about that because it's so seldom taught. And so we're going to have you take this training program that's offered by a third-party vendor. And good news is we'll pay for it, and it will pay for the training, and we'll pay for you to take the training. And it's a price that the government has to bear, but we need to do that in order to ensure that people are properly prepared to start doing the job. Well, there's a problem there. Somebody has just gone out and spent perhaps 6 figures getting a bachelor's degree, and then they come in and their employer pays for them to take some sort of, excuse me, other training program that's really designed to help the applicant demonstrate competency for what's really needed. And so instead, what we're looking to do is say, you can have the degree, or you can go spend a fraction of the time and a fraction of the money going to get this training that we would have you take anyway. And then you can come into the same job at the same pay without the debt, without the opportunity costs of 4 or more years on campus. And it's a faster, more affordable path in the door. So I know, this is not, the federal government is not the only employer that does things like this. And a lot of our focus on upskilling, while extremely justified, could and probably should transform into a conversation also about skills-based hiring and ensuring that the skills we're signaling a value for when we upskill are also being signaled before people even come in the door, because we might find that by doing that, we start to, first of all, find people who already have those skills, have already taken that training, et cetera. But we also start for the long term to change the conversation, to change the way people start to think about their post-secondary educational experience. And we start to really create demand for these other credentials, because there starts to be a supply of jobs where you can get a really solid family supporting job that for this much training, where it used to require a full degree and the whole bundle that you get when you get a 4-year degree. And I don't need to go into all of that. I know you are very familiar with the benefits of doing that, but that's I think the way that we've started to get beyond this catch-22 is to start where we're already putting out a signal. In other areas, we've broken down the credentials or the competencies to your kind of traditional hard skills. So you need to know these federal regulations in order to administer this grant program. There are also what are often termed the soft skills, and those theoretically can be measured with tests. There are tests out there, but I'm not sure that's the best approach, because there's sometimes mixed evidence on the efficacy of those types of credentials to measure soft skills. And you also don't want to have somebody who is an applicant for a position taking 10 assessments or having to demonstrate that they've achieved 10 third-party credentials. That's not realistic, and it's not something that's going to end up being scalable. So you want to really focus on the hard skills, the things that are absolutely essential for the job, and then start to look at other measurement tools. Again, getting beyond just, well, it's either got to be a degree or a test. And there's a scale, right? There's kind of a spectrum of really high value, but often that comes with cost and time, versus simplicity, which can often be, things that are quicker, things that are more affordable, things that can scale, especially going back to the catch-22 problem, where at first, not everybody's going to have these third-party credentials. Most of your applicants are still going to have either the traditional degree, or they're going to have to be literally trying to explain to you where they've gotten the experience or how they've taught themselves these credentials or these skills. So high on the value list would be industry recognized training, apprenticeship, tests. But then as you move down, you can start to look at portfolios, structured evaluations of experience that can either be validated by you, the employer, or can be validated by third parties. And there are a growing number of third parties that are doing that work, which is really important. It could be a signal for specific traditional higher education programs. So even that's a step in the right direction to say, well, we're not just going to accept a bachelor's degree as a check the box, but if you have a bachelor's degree from this institution or in this specific discipline, we've done our own validation. We recognize that program is really teaching you the skills that you know, but we're not just going to say any English program or any bachelor's degree is good enough. And then you can even do things to validate certain competencies, like structured interviews. And actually, we've been embarking on a pilot in the federal government separate from this work for a while around doing structured interviews and really trying to make that process more efficient, more effective, reducing bias. And I think that's really complementary to the skills-based hiring work that I'm talking about. And then, if you don't have any of that, if you don't have the time, if you don't have the resources to do that for some of your credentials, at the very least, you can start with just a simple short response. And like I said, that it's the applicant literally explaining to you, this is how I earned these skills, and this is why I think it's relevant. And the advantage of that is that you can start to, instead of just having 100 applications with 100 resumes, and they're all kind of in a roundabout way trying to explain to you why they have the competencies, even though they probably just took a quick glance at your job posting and sent you the same resume that they've sent to 20 other jobs. You then have to kind of sift through these things and say, okay, we're looking for leadership experience. Where in the resume do I see leadership experience? And you have to go through 100 times and look at that. Instead, if you directly ask the question, tell us about your leadership experience, it does away with the need for a lot of the BSing that we all know goes on with this process, and allows for you to directly ask the question and then put together a matrix of, here are all of my applicants on one axis, and then here are all of the competencies on the other axis. And you can really quickly and almost at a glance evaluate who are the top performers consistently across each of the different competencies, and that's who you interview. That by itself, those simple short responses, and by short, I should point out, we do not do essay questions in the federal government. They're actually prohibited. So we're talking about basically the length of a tweet, a couple of sentences that explains the experience related to a certain competency. If you don't have the tests, if you don't have some other better way to measure, or if you just don't have the time or the resources to do it, you start there. And so then you can compare those responses. That helps you get to the interview stage. And then during the interview stage, you use the structured interview to dig deeper and build upon your knowledge of, okay, who really has this experience, who really has these competencies. So as a result, you then end up with as I said, many doors that people can go through to get to the same job. They can take their own pathway, and they can end up with perhaps a much shorter, much more affordable path to a good job. And so what does this do long term? I think it obviously can transform how HR does its work. I think it's really beneficial, and we've already seen that it can be beneficial for HR staff where there's less drudgery, there's less putting together, just kind of in a roadway going through these applications and checking the box, and because we're really there's a lot more noise than signal in the old process. You ended up as an HR staff person having to go do it again and again because often, as I said, in a lot of cases, or I should say, in more than half of cases, it didn't result in a hire. So you had to go back all the way through the process and start again. And again, instead of sifting through resumes and looking for the right words, you're actually doing a meaningful, holistic evaluation of the applicant's skills. And so we get beyond this regime of job postings and resumes and cover letters. We start to really be able to impact diversity and inclusion in a meaningful way, because we're not just looking at the same applicant pool we've always been looking at. And you create a more enjoyable experience for applicants, for hiring managers, for HR. And remember, this is the first interaction that somebody has with your company or with your government agency. And they're saying to you, I like you enough that I want to work for you. And yet the experience overwhelmingly for the applicant can be extremely frustrating and not enjoyable, even if you get the job, much less if you just kind of send your resume into the black hole and never hear back. Obviously, this has the potential to disrupt higher education for reasons that I know this group is very familiar with, and I won't spend a lot of time there. But it also starts, and I alluded to this, but it starts to create meaningful market competition for these credentials, because if employers are actually signaling for them, then that credential can compete against other similar credentials and can compete against traditional higher education. And that starts to be the employer endorsed pathway to a job. And that's what I think can ultimately transform how people get an education and how they go on to the workplace. So I will say it's early in our process in the federal government, but I really do believe we've found a recipe for success. And I'm excited to see the things that continue on after I've left, and as other people who are extremely capable, including the people at OMB, OPM, and the civil servants at my agency, and all of the others who are working to implement this, really beginning this month and then into 2021 and beyond. So I think there's a lot of potential here. There is really an opportunity for the government to be an exemplar to the private sector, which never happens. And I'm optimistic that it can start to, because the federal government is such a big employer, it can start to have a transformative impact on the market for skills, and can really show that the things that we all have been working towards for a long time to make skills-based hiring work are possible in the real world. And we'll see where it goes from here. But I think I'm going to leave it there and try to leave the remaining time for questions if you've got them. And just want to say thank you for having me and spending the time. We'd be happy to, if you just want to connect later and don't have a question kind of for the group, more than happy to discuss, more than happy to find ways to work together in the future.
We actually do have some questions. Your first one, for many federal positions, I'm sorry, this is from Marilee Mayo, wants to know if we can kind of get a sense for how many federal positions have already changed their job descriptions to allow for hiring. via alternative training course sequences or other alternative beyond the four-year degree. It's kind of a three-part question, so I'm going to go ahead and
Yeah.
ask all three. And she would love to know which agencies and or occupations have already started embracing this change the fastest. And then finally, whether systems such as USA, jobs.gov have changed their user interface to start adapting to these new practices.
Yeah, great questions. So it's some of this is happening all at once across all of the agencies. So all of the agencies are moving forward at once. We at Education have tried to get ahead of the game a little bit, just because we're trying to be overachievers. But this really will, as you kind of alluded to, OPM has to change its policies. We have to update the way that our systems work, and we actually use a different vendor than most of the other agencies, so there are additional complications there. So it's a process. I don't think you're going to see every job posting in 2021 start to do this in a way that we all would like to see. It's not going to be perfect at first. I can tell you that right now. The first step is to update the guidance and to just simply allow for this stuff to happen. There are a lot of rules that need to be changed, from the obvious, like jobs no longer requiring a degree, to the more in the weeds, where I was talking about the short response questions. That was, as I said, that essay questions are prohibited. And so we had to get written assurance that that type of short response would not be considered an essay question for purposes of doing that. So there are a lot of things like that. But if you've ever been on OPM's website, each job series has documentation that goes along with it. And in a lot of cases, these are big documents that need to be carefully updated. And that can't all happen at once. It's just not possible. And so we're working step by step. We're trying to first remove the prohibitions, and then we're going to start to do this in a way that that really embraces this in the multiple pathways. We're affirmatively signaling for credentials, not just kind of allowing for them. And that's the part that will take time, and of course will come with some culture changes, because people are not used to doing this. So it will be an evolution for sure. And I'm hopeful that the next administration will embrace this just as we have. But it remains to be seen if they'll make it as much of a priority as we have. So I hope they do. I think it's certainly something that crosses party lines and is something that I believe they should support, but that's ultimately up to them, because I know they'll have other priorities too.
Got it. I understand we have about 10 minutes left, so I want to ask, I think we have now three more questions. What are the barriers to better partnerships between employers and community colleges around industry credentials and skills? Universities often teach higher and different skills that are needed and at much higher debt to students. Tends to be cheaper and shorter cycle to gain that certification or skills. And then cost to potential employee could be lower, and employers don't have to do all the work themselves. So I'm sorry, his questions are, what are the barriers to better partnerships between the employers and community colleges? So
some of them were our rules, frankly, at the Department of Education, and we've tried to change that through some of our recent rulemaking. We want to not say that that's the only pathway, but we want to make sure it's clear that partnerships with employers are allowable. Previously, those partnerships often had to go not only through the leadership chain at the college or university, but often had to be approved by the accrediting agency's board. And so that added another huge barrier that often just made people say it's not worth it. We've changed that to make it more efficient, where staff at an accrediting agency can now just make the decision, rather than having to go to the board. We've also tried to explicitly make clear that curriculum developed within an institution can be aligned to workforce needs. It doesn't only have to be aligned to, what the faculty decides. So if an employer has, or if a college has a partnership with an outside employer, they can work directly with the employer and develop that as kind of an alternative, or approve it through an alternative governance structure that doesn't just have to be about the traditional faculty senate and all that. But the other barrier, frankly, is the college for all, everybody has to get a 4-year degree mentality, and often that results in, of course, the kind of single track in high school. There are definite reasons to oppose tracking in high school, but the only thing worse is if there's only one track, but it's still a track, and it's college prep. That's beneficial for a lot of people, but it shouldn't be the only option, in my opinion. But less talked about is what happens at community colleges, where increasingly community colleges, by enrollment, some of their largest programs are designed to prepare students to go through a 2-year program and then graduate from a 4-year degree in the liberal arts. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That can turn out well for a lot of people, and has turned out well for a lot of people. But the vast majority of people do not complete a 4-year degree after they've started with a 2-year liberal arts program. And the associate in liberal arts is not the most, you can look at our college scorecard. It has data on this. It's really not, at the top of the list. In fact, it's near the bottom of the list in terms of labor market value for a degree. These 2-year associate in arts that are designed to lead to a 4-year program. If the student completes that 4-year program, often they're doing really well. But if they drop out somewhere in between, they usually have the debt and not a lot of skills to show for it. So that can be a real challenge.
Perfect. I have one more question I want to ask you before we close. We have about 5 minutes left. This comes from a workforce development board. What may be the potential that higher education can begin to accept these credentials and as credits for further education to pursue degrees?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's ultimately up to the institutions and to some extent the accreditors. We've again tried to make that easier through our regulations and to clarify some misconceptions and put some things in our regulations that say, you have every right to reject transfer credit and credit for prior learning if you want. And some institutions just say we're not accepting any, and that's their right. But what you can't do is say our institution is better than yours, our faculty is better than yours, our accreditor is better than yours, and so we're not going to even look at your credits. There has to be a substantive evaluation of the credits, and you actually have to do a meaningful consideration of what a student is bringing to you, and not just say, not just have these policies in place that are frankly elitist, where you're out of hand rejecting somebody because they went to a school that you see as less than. From the workforce board perspective, though, there's a huge role to play, and I'm hopeful that workforce boards are able to band together and do some of this at scale, because many of the employers that are looking at doing skills-based hiring are not in just one state, not in just one locality. And so they need something that's scalable across all of these different jurisdictions. And they need to know that if they're going to signal for a certain credential and they're going to hire people who have attained that credential, that there's going to be workforce funds available in each of the places where they do business to be able to hire. So I can't see who that question was from, but workforce boards are a huge part of this and would love to discuss.
Jamae, that about wraps us up with Q&A.
really, really good information. I have a million questions, but I'm not going to do that. Like Michael said, you know, he and I have had a couple of conversations prepping for this. And while we've come a long way, nobody's really, really doing it from an equitable, I mean, broad scale companies doing this. Obviously, the government taking a lead on trying to do this is huge. And I do hope that we see this next administration moving this. I do know that we worked with the prior administration around skills. So like you say, it hopefully is nonpartisan and very, very important for the future of working and the future of learning. Tiffany, email Tiffany or myself if you want if Michael's contact, and we may.
I was just about to put it in the chat also.
Okay,
so.
perfect. Do that. That's awesome. And you can connect with Michael on LinkedIn. So that is it for this discussion. I want to remind everybody that tomorrow is our last keynote. We've got our friend Josh Kopis, previously with NAWB, now at JFF Labs, and Dr. Angela Jackson, talking about, you know, the workforce system and their role in the future of work and the X Prize and MIT Solve, which will be very, very interesting. Share it. Again, this is not about trying to get people to pay for registrations every day. It's about getting the right people in the conversation and a community of knowledge sharing. So hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. That's at 10 a.m. Mountain, noon Eastern. All of these are recorded and they are put in the community platform for sharing. And Michael, just for you to know, we have about 150 people in the community right now, and this will go out to the entire community for them to listen. So thank you very much. And we really appreciate the time that you put into this. And obviously someone texted me and said, you seem to have more knowledge than most anybody has had in a long time on skills-based hiring. And I totally agree. You hit all of the right points.
Very overly generous, but thank you. I hope there's opportunities to work with the people on this group and people in your network in the future. So again, don't hesitate to reach out, and really appreciate you having me.
Okay. Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.